Look, it's some sort of a vigil that's going on here. Hey, what's up?
The time is 6:03, so I think it's about time we get started. I want to start out by saying thank you so much to everyone who came out here tonight. It's so good to see so many people. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Kat. I am with Katarungan, and we are a Filipino solidarity org that fights for peace and justice in the Philippines. Thank you. We are hosting this vigil as a part of a global day of action to commemorate the 49th anniversary of the day martial law was declared in the Philippines. And today, thank you. And today we not only remember those who bravely fought against Marcos and his tyranny, we simultaneously honor those who continue to resist against Duterte. Living in the heart of the imperial empire, it is our responsibility to advocate and promote the needs of the communities we serve. This includes pushing for the Philippine Human Rights Act, which will suspend military aid to the Philippines until Duterte and state forces are held accountable. We must also condemn the anti-terror law, which tries to suppress and criminalize the voices speaking the truth about the oppressive Duterte regime and the real state of Philippine society. Journalists, activists, students, and workers are routinely targeted, harassed, attacked, and killed. As we remember the tyranny of the martial law era, let us also remember all those who fought back. And as we talk about the present atrocities of the Duterte regime, let us also lift up those who are fighting. All right, I'll be introducing this first speaker, which is Rob Cheng from Katarungan. Thank you.
Thank you for that intro, Kat. Yeah, first off, for everyone who doesn't know me, I am Rob Cheng. I'm the chairperson of Katarungan, which is it means justice in Filipino, and it is a solidarity organization of both Filipinos, but mainly non-Filipinos who are organizing in common struggle with the human rights campaign in the Philippines, right? So why are we here today just commemorating martial law? Is this just a somber event? Are we just here to cry and mourn the people who have passed away? No, right? It's not just that, because what we're saying today is that the crimes under martial law, under Marcos, are the ones that we're repeating again under Duterte. Duterte, who has hailed Marcos as a hero and reinterred him in the hero cemetery, right? All of this revisionist history and all of the Marcos family who are now holding office once again in the Philippines. But what are we doing here in front of the White House? Why are we here in Washington, D.C., and not just organizing and supporting our friends back home, right? Because we have to remember that in the 70s and 80s, there was a robust resistance that existed based out of here in Washington, D.C., but also in other parts of the United States, of both Filipinos and non-Filipinos who stood arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder with the Filipino people who were resisting martial law, right? It wasn't just them struggling in a vacuum. And we know that the United States, this government, deliberately keeps the Philippine economy and society backwards in order for it to reap the benefits of that. And one of the reasons we're calling attention to this today is because we are pushing for everyone to prop and talk about the Philippine Human Rights Act. We are calling for the United States government to halt its military funding for the AFP and the PNP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police. Since Duterte took office, 30,000 people have been killed in his war on drugs. And these aren't inflated numbers like some people are saying. This is their self-reported numbers. The Philippine National Police admitted to killing 30,000 people. Kian de los Santos, the person here in this photo, on the right half of the painting, was killed. He was unarmed. The police gave him a gun and said, "Run," and then shot him in the back. Very openly caught on tape that they falsified this person's murder. And that's why we draw attention and continuity between Kian and Liliosa Hilao, the first martyr under the martial law period, who was imprisoned by the Marcos regime and tortured for 14 days until they presented her with a cup of poison and told her, "This is your only way out." So that is why we are gathered here today. We want all of the groups here, all of the people here, standing in solidarity with the Filipino people to take action and affect the change we want to see in the Philippines by doing what we can to stop U.S. taxpayer money from going overseas to fund the Philippine military. In the midst of horrifying COVID conditions, the Philippines, I think, was the #2 worst affected by COVID in Southeast Asia. Where did the Philippines spending go? They made a $2 billion arms purchase from the United States for a fleet of helicopters to do counterinsurgency operations. And we can't let that stand. So I want to thank you all for letting me speak, letting me take up time. Want to call everyone to please look up and push for the PHRA, the Philippine Human Rights Act, that we are currently fighting to get passed in order to end this pipeline, this unaccountable pipeline of weapons and arms to the Philippine military. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rob. All right. Up next, we have Dan Moriarty with the Office of Global Concerns.
Thanks. Hi, I am Dan Moriarty with the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. We represent Maryknoll missioners, Catholic priests, sisters, brothers, and lay missioners working in countries around the world, including many, many years in the Philippines. Miriam College was founded by the Maryknoll Sisters in 1926, and I have a good friend, former lay missioner, is now working at the Mindanao Peace Building Institute. Maryknoll Sisters run an ecological sanctuary in Baguio City, and so we know from powerful personal experience what our faith teaches us is true, which is that the people of the Philippines are our brothers and sisters here in the United States. Our lives are bound up together. Our work is rooted in this simple truth. It's a simple truth, but it's a powerful truth and a countercultural truth, that we are all God's children, sisters and brothers across borders and oceans. We're called to encounter together, to relationship with our wider human family. And that encounter leads to solidarity, strengthens our commitment to human rights, and drives us to work for the common good. It grounds us in nonviolence, which is another thing we've learned from the Filipino people through the People Power movement, both people from the church and civil society who inspired the world with their struggle for peace with justice. So when we hear about the reign of violence and terror in the Philippines under President Duterte, when we hear about the way political activists and faith groups are being red tagged, when we read about martial law, especially today on this solemn anniversary, and extrajudicial killings, we cannot be silent. This is true for people of faith around the world. Faith demands global solidarity, but it's especially true for those of us here in the United States, because our government has a long history of violent colonial rule, militarism, and support for abusive governments in the Philippines. So we're tied to the Filipino people in that way too, and that's why we support the Philippines Human Rights Act. The United States government must not arm, fund, or otherwise support the Duterte regime in their violent persecution of Filipinos. We join the Faith Working Group on Human Rights in the Philippines, and we call on other faith groups to join us in this demand. Today is a day of solemn memory as we mark the anniversary of the declaration of martial law under the Marcos regime, but it's also a day of hope. Today is the International Day of Peace. So if I may, I'd like to take a moment for prayer. First, in silent memory of the people killed by the Marcos dictatorship, by U.S. forces and arms in the Philippines since the 19th century, and all those who've died under the current regime. And I pray, O God of nonviolence, God of justice, God of mercy, loving God of all creation, on this International Day of Peace, we join our prayer in solidarity to the prayers of our Filipino sisters and brothers. We ask you to strengthen and guide us in our work for peace and justice. We ask that you soften the hearts of our leaders, that they might recognize the humanity of the victims of violence in the Philippines and cease to be complicit in it. And we pray that you console and heal the Filipino people, remain close to them, and accompany them in their struggle for peace with justice. Amen.
Thank you, Dan. I apologize, I forgot to say it earlier, but if you guys could please sign the sign-in sheet when you get the chance. It's over here by this area, so please, when you get the chance, sign in. And our next speaker is going to be Gabby, who is reading a solidarity message from Colectivo Kausai.
Hello everyone. So this is a letter of support from Colectivo because they weren't able to be here today. Relatives, today on this sacred harvest moon, we members of Colectivo Kausai stand with our relatives of the Philippines as they hold this vigil, remembering the fallen under the brutal dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Remember and honor their spirits, the struggle of the 70s and the 80s, as their resistance laid a path for liberation for future generations. We also remember and honor those who have fallen under the current brutal dictator, Duterte. We honor their struggle on their indigenous lands, knowing that their current resistance will lay a path for the liberation for the future generations of people in the Philippines. The warrior spirits of our compass here inspire us to fight, inspire us to seek justice, and thus find peace. We pray that their souls may rest in power and in peace, that their fight was not in vain. We send prayers of protection and strength to our kasamas on this land and across the ocean who continue to fight for true liberation. We are saddened we cannot be here with you in person to stand beside you on this day, but we will always be with you in spirit. We love you, we care for you, we honor your ancestors. Munsmawa.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Colectivo Kausai. One more time. Hi, I'm Norman from Onigbayan, and I'm also one of the MCs for today. Sorry, traffic was kind of wild, but it be like that sometimes. So now we'd like to welcome up our fourth speaker, Kristen from American Friends Service Committee.
Thanks, Norman. Hi, everyone. It's amazing to be with you on this beautiful day, this holy day, this sacred day, this sad day, and this day of triumph, because the triumph is that we are standing here, that we have gathered from all of our different walks of life, that we are gathered as people who have been descended from the incredible Filipino warriors of the Philippines and of the diaspora around the world, and those of us who stand in solidarity today to say that we are doing this together to call for human rights in the Philippines and for Filipinos around the world. So I'm standing here both because I have the honor of working for a global Quaker organization, the American Friends Service Committee, that believes in peace with justice and the dignity of God in everyone, and that calls us to action, that calls us to put our feet into action and to work together for change. And so we call on all people of faith and conscience to stand together and to call out the human rights abuses that are happening in the Philippines. But I also stand here today as someone who has lived and worked and watched human rights violations in the Philippines. So 20 years ago, when I was living in the Philippines, I had the incredible honor of being on the island of Mindoro, working with indigenous Hmong people as someone who was there to stand as a human rights observer, to be in the trenches with people, literally as we were watching people be kidnapped and tortured, and the human rights violations that had continued from the Marcos regime onward. And so for me, that's what I sit with today, is that the human rights violations that happened under martial law, under the martial law that we honor in this moment, and all of the people who suffered and died and were tortured and survived through that era, but also that has happened under every presidency since then. Human rights violations never stopped. The stories that I heard from my Filipino kasamas then and now are the same. And that we continue to see repression because it is deeply embedded in the system. And so we are calling in this moment not only for the ousting of Duterte, of seeing Duterte be removed as president, but we know that a new president will not necessarily change ongoing human rights violations. So we need entire change in the system, and that means that we, those of us who live in this country, who vote in this country, have an obligation and an opportunity to call on our members of Congress to say enough. We cannot be supporting a government that would do that to their own people, that we have this opportunity with the Filipino Human Rights Act that is moving before Congress to say here's a real chance for us to put our feet into action and to stand in solidarity with Filipino people here in the U.S., around the world, and in the Philippines. And so for all of us who are here today, those of us walking by, those of us here honoring another place of power or holding the power and potential human rights abuses coming out of this place of power, those of us watching online tonight, I hope that you will find it in your hearts some moment of inspiration and even pain to say, I'm going to pick up the phone, I'm going to call my member of Congress, I'm going to take action online, I'm going to look at whatever links we drop in the chat to take action, and that we are going to stand in solidarity until the Filipino Human Rights Act is passed, until we can see the ending of Filipino human rights violations in the Philippines, and a new day for all Filipino people. So I hope you will join with me, because kasamas that I know and love in the Philippines who are continuing to watch generation after generation of people be abused are waiting for that, are waiting for us to join them in solidarity, and now is the moment. So thanks, friends, for being here tonight. Thanks for watching, and let's join together and get this bill passed. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kristen. So our next speaker is Bernard from Isang Bayan.
A somber and courageous evening to everyone who is standing with us here. My name is Bernard Fajardo, the Regional Coordinator for Isang Bayan for the DMV area. Formed earlier this year, Isang Bayan is a broad coalition of Filipinos representing a broad spectrum of political persuasions, all united for democracy at home and abroad, and with the goal of building a strong and unified national opposition for the Philippine national elections in May 2022. I stand in unity and solidarity with all of you here tonight as we remember and commemorate the Filipinos who suffered and fought against the dictator Marcos during his decades-long rule, including 9 years of martial law. In the 21 years that Marcos was in power, he has stolen billions of dollars from the Filipino people. He disappeared hundreds, brutally murdered thousands, and imprisoned and tortured tens of thousands more. His actions haunt us Filipinos to this day. It has been 49 years since that time of terror, suffering, and poverty. We remember those who have suffered and died under the Marcos regime, but we must also remember those who have fought against him. We must remember those who have continued our people's long history of resistance against those who seek to subjugate and silence us. We must remember those who have set aside their differences to form a united opposition against an enemy so heinous and vile that it warranted the resistance of the broadest coalition of forces. We must remember them and take to heart the lessons that we can learn from their resistance. These lessons of history are more crucial now, as Filipinos are once again suffering under the rule of another dictator, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte is a self-avowed Marcos supporter and disciple. Just like his idol, Duterte has stolen from the Filipino people. Just recently, the Commission on Audit has uncovered severe malfeasance and corruption amounting to billions of pesos in the Duterte administration. Our Filipino communities back home are suffering and dying of COVID-19. As the Duterte regime and his minions continue to profit from business negotiations with big pharmaceutical companies. Just like his idol, Duterte has facilitated the wholesale torture, imprisonment, and massacre of the Filipino people. And just like his idol,
Duterte has set his eyes on extending his grip on the seat of the presidency beyond the term limits imposed by the Philippine Constitution. All of these, the heightened and blatant corruption, the abuse of human rights, and the disregard for the term limits reminds us of the dark days of the Marcos regime. Duterte has announced that he is running for the vice presidency next elections, a clear ploy to remain in power and avoid culpability for his crimes against the Filipino people. We must not let this happen. When we say never again to martial law, we must also say wakasan na, end the Duterte government now. We must use all the avenues of struggle that's available to us in order to fight Duterte and his efforts to cling to power. One way to fight Duterte and his minions is to give them a resounding defeat in the upcoming 2022 elections. This is why we need to talk to our families, our friends, and the Filipino community at large. We must persuade them, if they are eligible, to register to vote and then to vote in 2022. We should sign petitions asking for the extension of voter registration. We must be vigilant in guarding our votes, prevent voter disenfranchisement, and ensure a clean and honest elections. We must be adamant in forming a united opposition against this administration so that we can usher in a government that is democratic and competent, a government that protects our national sovereignty and promotes human rights, and a government that is the exact opposite of the Marcos Duterte regimes. Thank you.
Let's give one more round of applause for Bennett. And now coming up, our next speaker, we have a speaker from Anakbayan, DC. Right.
Hi everyone, my name is Raya. I'm here with Anakbayan, Washington, D.C. Anakbayan is a comprehensive mass organization of Filipino youth that organizes and fights for national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines. 49 years ago today, the U.S.-backed dictator Ferdinand Marcos signed Proclamation number 1081, which declared martial law in the Philippines. It led to some of the darkest years in the history of our people, marked by mass incarceration, mass torture, and mass killings. Around 70,000 Filipinos were captured and imprisoned, 34,000 were tortured, and over 3,200 were killed. The regime still spews the myth that the Philippines lived a golden age under Marcos. In reality, the increased infrastructure spending by the regime aimed at displacing the indigenous people of the Philippines came at the cost of their lives. Although the Philippines is rich in natural resources, our people were sent into poverty, deprived of the land they tilled, wages for workers decreased, and national debt skyrocketed to over $24 billion. Today, Duterte carries the legacy of Ferdinand Marcos as a brutal, corrupt, and murderous dictator. Under Duterte, over 10 times as many people have been killed in his so-called war on drugs. The state has killed hundreds of community leaders, activists, and critics with impunity. Over 120,000 people have been displaced by the military and by bombings in Mindanao. And more than 36,000 people have died from Duterte's gross mishandling of the COVID pandemic. In 2014, Duterte imposed martial law in Mindanao, which took a deadly toll on the Moro people and the natural land. The pretext for martial law in Mindanao was largely the regime's ongoing counterinsurgency program, which criminalizes, disappears, and kills defenders of land, indigenous people, Filipino Muslims, and anyone who poses a threat to the power of the regime. Under martial law, Mindanao accounted for 2/3 of environmental land defenders killed in 2017 and 1/3 of those killed in 2018. Among them are 8 indigenous farmers who fought against a coffee plantation in southern Cotabato. The terror imposed on indigenous communities in the Philippines by Duterte go hand in hand with protecting private interests. After martial law was lifted in Mindanao in 2019, Duterte went on to attack Lumad schools as its next focal target. By attempting to cleanse the land of the Lumad, Duterte seeks to make way for mining corporations and plantations to enter indigenous land. Combined with his counterinsurgency campaigns, large-scale war on drugs, and militarization of indigenous communities, Duterte has effectively waged a war on the Philippines, showing us how he carries on the legacy of Ferdinand Marcos. In the same proclamation that declared martial law in 1972, Marcos cited the communist threat as a justification. Today, Duterte cites the same threat as justification for his crimes. But there's no real justification for his crimes, and there's no quantifying the violence imposed through martial law by any U.S.-backed regime. Its legacy is still a burden on the spirits of our families. Tonight, we commemorate all victims of martial law and all who suffered under the U.S. Marcos regime, and we honor the ongoing resistance to not only combat the continued denial of history by the U.S.-backed Duterte regime, but also to prevent it from happening again. It's clear that the dictatorship is threatened by rising resistance and people power. As youth and ND activists, we carry on the revolutionary spirit that persisted through the dark times of martial law. We recognize the struggle of the heroes and martyrs, from the cities to the countryside, who boldly resisted the U.S.-backed dictatorship by any means necessary. We call for the ousting of the U.S. Duterte regime. Today, as the parallels of fascism and dictatorship in the Philippines are even more apparent, it's crucial for us to continue arousing, organizing, and mobilizing within our own communities. Our struggle for self-determination through the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines sustains and strengthens the power of the Filipino people. And we always remember that history is not shaped by fascist leaders such as Marcos and Duterte, but by the masses and the masses alone. So we're going to do a chant. You guys have to chant with me. Never again, never again, never again to martial law. Never again, never again, never again to martial law. Thank you.
Thank you, Raya and Anakbayan DC, for that speech and for co-hosting this vigil with us. Next up, we're going to have Migrante and Gabriela speak.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our vigil today to commemorate the victims of martial law under Marcos and, of course, the thousands of people who have died under the Duterte administration. So I'm here today speaking, not really planned, but we just want to share that at this event we had elements of the Philippine consulate roaming around. They've been regulars of our actions. So it's something that we want to share to the group because of our intensifying actions, right, in our dissent, in our activism, in our work to for genuine change in the Philippines. We see the Philippine consulate or the embassy, the Philippine government trying to disunite our ranks. This lady actually approached me and told me to meet with her separately, that she could help me and I could help her, right? But we all know that no talks between myself or this lady from the Philippine embassy could change and could make our struggle victorious, right? It is in the mass movement. It is in the our strength of building this movement, right? In educating, organizing, mobilizing our communities, that we can actually liberate the Philippines from the bureaucrat capitalists, from the U.S. imperialists, and from the feudal landlords in the Philippines. So I want to pass my mic to Joe and share more.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Yeah, so just to let you know, and let's be clear on who is trying to surveil us tonight. It is Miss Soledad from a section officer at the Philippine Embassy. And she tries to come to our events since 2019, actually, in DC. She tries to surveil and get the names of us who are advocates and activists, trying to red tag us. Red tagging is not something new. It is very much something that was birthed during the Marcos era and through martial law. This embassy officials continue to surveil our communities because they want to know who are the ones who are doing the work on the ground. But consistently and time over again, they should be the ones to serve the Filipino communities, especially here. But why is it us that continue to be the ones to get the harassment, the surveillance, and even to dismiss, not dismiss, but continue to neglect our communities? They try to say that we want to collaborate with you, but instead, we're just being used as pawns as their propaganda. Most recently, and I'm not ashamed, so I'm going to take off my face mask. Most recently, Gab DC really got curtailed by the Philippine Embassy, trying to break the unity among our members. They tried to persuade our members by offering them a lavish dinner at the Philippine Embassy, only to hold up their signs of red tagging. When some Filipino women attended the embassy, they saw Gabriella's logo and left right away. They said, "What is this?" Until now, we also ask, "What is this?" What is this? But there's no way, with the exploitation and abuse of our people, especially now under the COVID-19 pandemic, there's not one Kabayan member in the Filipino community who hasn't lost someone to COVID, who hasn't lost a colleague, a friend, a sister, a sibling. They are scrambling to make ends meet, but even worse, scrambling to pay for funerals. They cannot even grieve the death of their loved ones. So our message to you is very clear. You cannot stop the National Democratic Movement of the Filipino people. You cannot stop a grassroots movement. Right. Thank you all very much for coming. And I hope that we continue this solidarity for our grassroots organizing, because we know that the people in the Philippines are literally dying day to day, case by case, not just under COVID, but the mass arrests, the continued AFP forces and attacks everywhere in every province, who continue to vilify our grassroots movement. But they will not win, and they are not winning. That's why the Philippine Embassy is so desperate to try to divide us. But we will stand together united, no matter what, for the aspirations and the true liberations of our people. Thank you. All right.
So just let this sharing inform your membership about the sharings we just informed you all about, right? If any of your membership is approached by the Philippine Embassy, to let leaders of our organization know, so they could let our organizations about this, so we could tighten up our security. But let's also take this a challenge, right, to strengthen our organizations, grow our membership, right, continue to do our studies, but also ultimately to continue to serve the people. So thank you, mga kasamas. Have a good evening.
I guess thank you, Kasamas from Migrante and Gabriela, for talking about red tagging today, especially as we both fight it before in the Marcos era, and then we fight it today against the current Duterte regime. Which also relates to our next art piece by Kuma, which showcases multiple martyrs of both the Marcos regime as well as the Duterte regime. Let's give it up for Kuma.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Just a brief couple of words about this painting. My partner and I worked on this painting. I'm a member of Anak Bayan DC too. We have two martyrs of both martial law under Marcos and Quilon de los Santos under the Duterte regime. So a little bit about Lilosa. Lilosa was a student activist and was considered the first martyr under the Marcos era. She was a communication arts student, and she was one of the first, known to be held in the detention center and killed under the Marcos regime. And to this side, we have Kian de los Santos, who is a 17-year-old boy who was murdered through extrajudicial killing in the Philippines under Duterte. It's been about 4 years since his death, and I wanted to put them side by side as to show that not much has changed from Marcos and not much has changed under Duterte. They didn't ask to be martyrs of our movement, and I wanted to show this piece to commemorate the both of them and share it with all of you. I think we're going to do a brief moment of silence, and I think some kasamas will pass out some candles, and feel free to just come up and light some candles and place them around as you say your words of peace, remembering the resistance, the rich resistance that we continue to fight against, both here in the U.S., against the regime, the Trump regime, the Duterte regime, and commemorating those who were lost under Marcos.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone. As Kuma just said, we'll be passing out candles, and please feel free to place them by this art piece during this moment of silence. Thank you everyone for placing your candles here. This is very beautiful. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to introduce two artists from multiple ND orgs that are going to regale us with a song. Yeah, that's you.
Yeah. All right. Hey, I'm Leon. I'm from Anak Bayan, DC. I'm an artist. Well, I'm not an artist, but I'm going to be performing a song called Marcha ng Bayan. It means March of the People, with my colleague here, Rob.
Hey everyone, you heard me speak already. I'm Rob, chairperson of Katarungan. Also, open invite. If anyone knows the tune, we have extra lyric sheets if anyone wants to join in. Question mark. Looking to my left, looking to my right. Not seeing any. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yep.
So if you don't know the tune, it'll be hard to follow along, but I was asking if you know the tune, the lyrics. But at least you can...
Feel free to take the lyric sheets home with you and look it up later. Yeah. Let me go.
Yeah, just to introduce the song briefly, it's a song about, like, y'all heard the speakers and their, like, passionate statements, right? It's about the whole country, of all the people, all the different classes, different sectors uniting and fight for freedom and let the whole world hear it. And so, yeah, that's what it's going to be. We're going to sing this song.
Yeah, and that's why it's really important, and we chose this is because, you know, as it names the different sectors of Philippine society, that's what we're looking to do here, right? With building the broad united front against the Duterte regime, against U.S. imperialism, and, you know, knowing that it takes all of us together to struggle and not just, you know, struggling in a vacuum. We're all in this together, right? So, go ahead.
Right. Manggagawa at magsasaka, kabataan na profesional, mga alagad ng simbahan, negosyante at binunong makabayan, tayo na makabit-bisig, tapusin ang daan-taong pananahimik, panahon na upang ang ating tinig ay marinig sa buong daigdig. Tayo na magsama-sama sa pagdurot sa imperialista, panahon na upang makaisa, lansagin ang pasistang diktadura. Nasa atin ang tunay na lakas, siyak nasa atin ang bukas. Manggagawa, magsasaka, kabataan na profesional, mga alagad ng simbahan, negosyante at pinunong makabayan, tayo na makabit-bisig, tapusin ang daan-taong pananahimik, panahon na upang ang ating tinig ay marinig sa buong daigdig. Tayo na magsama-sama sa pagdurog sa imperialista, panahon na upang makaisa, lansagin ang pasistang diktadura. Nasa ating ng tunay na lakas, tiyak nasa ating ang bukas. Tayo na at makaisa, isulong ang pambansang demokrasya. Let's do a chant! Ang tao, ang bayan, ngayon ay lumalaban! Ngayon ay lumalaban! Ang tao, ang bayan!
Thank you! Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Here's my co-MC, Norman. I'm Katarungan.
Yeah, and I'm Norman of Anagbayan. We want to just say thank you everybody for coming out today. We want to continue remembering what happened during the Marcos era so that does not repeat, so that we can continue the struggle into the Duterte era and onwards. And so we must remember, never again, never again, never again to martial law. Never again, never again, never again to martial law. But never again to martial law. Never again to martial law. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, and don't forget the sign-in sheet.
Oh, wait, we doing a group photo?
Oh, group photo. Oh, yeah, let's do a group photo.
This is your first thing. You have to be in a group photo. You got that third eye open, right? Group photo. Who's got a good camera? I got like the iPhone. Is that you? Got a good photo? I got a good photo. I can take it. Okay. I got a good phone. Okay, sure.
Thanks, Tori.
Chrissy, Joe.
Okay.
All right.
Wait for it.
1, 2, 3. Another one. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much.
Are you good?